You've probably heard the saying, money makes the world go round. But what if one country's money doesn't just make the world go round, but actually controls it? Today, we're talking about the US dollar and how it transformed from simple paper currency into arguably the most powerful weapon on Earth. It's a story of gold, oil, and a global power play that affects every single one of us. The story begins in the rubble of World War II. In 1944, leaders from 44 Allied nations gathered in a small town in New Hampshire called Bretton Woods. Their mission was to rebuild a shattered global economy. They needed a stable, reliable system to prevent the kind of economic chaos that led to the war. The solution they came up with was ingenious and would change the world forever. They pegged their currencies to the US dollar, and the US dollar in turn was pegged to gold at a fixed rate of $35 per ounce. This was the birth of the Bretton Woods system. For the first time, the world had a single dominant currency backed by the largest gold reserve on the planet, held securely in American vaults. It was a promise of stability. Any country could, in theory, exchange its dollars for a fixed amount of US gold. This created immense trust in the dollar. Nations around the globe started holding US dollars as their primary reserve currency because it was seen as good as gold. This was the first step in the dollar's journey to global dominance. For about 25 years, the system worked. Global trade flourished and economies rebuilt themselves. America wasn't just a military superpower. It was now the undisputed financial center of the world. But this golden age couldn't last forever. By the late 1960s, the US was facing a perfect storm. The costs of the Vietnam War and massive domestic spending programs were piling up. The government was printing more and more dollars to pay its bills, far more than it had in gold reserves to back them up. Other countries, especially France, grew nervous. They saw the US printing money out of thin air and started calling America's bluff, demanding their gold in exchange for their dollars. The US gold reserves began to dwindle at an alarming rate. President Richard Nixon found himself in a corner. On August 15, 1971, he made a shocking announcement that sent tremors through the global financial system. He unilaterally severed the US dollar's link to gold. This event is famously known as the Nixon shock. Just like that, the Bretton Woods system collapsed. The dollar was no longer backed by gold. It was now backed by, well, nothing but the full faith and credit of the United States. It became what's known as a fiat currency. You can imagine the panic. The world's financial anchor was gone. What would happen next? Would the dollar collapse? Would global trade grind to a halt? This is where the story takes a fascinating turn. Just as the dollar's dominance seemed to be ending, American policymakers pulled off one of the greatest strategic pivots in modern history. The world was in the midst of another crisis, the 1973 oil crisis. OPEC, the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, had imposed an oil embargo, causing prices to skyrocket and sending Western economies into a tailspin. The US saw an opportunity in this chaos. They struck a deal primarily with Saudi Arabia, the world's largest oil producer. The terms were simple but brilliant. The US would provide military protection and weapons to Saudi Arabia. In return, Saudi Arabia would price all of its oil sales exclusively in US dollars. And not just that, they would also invest their excess oil profits back into US government bonds. Soon, other OPEC countries followed suit. This was the birth of the petrodollar system. Suddenly, every country in the world that needed to buy oil, which was basically every country first needed to acquire US dollars. This created a massive, constant, and artificial global demand for the dollar. It didn't matter that it wasn't backed by gold anymore. It was now backed by something even more essential for a modern economy: oil. The dollar had found a new anchor, and its global dominance was not just restored, it was supercharged. So how does this history translate into the US dollar being a weapon today? It all comes down to control. Because the dollar is the world's primary reserve currency, the US sits at the center of the global financial system. Think of it like a global financial plumbing system. Almost every major international transaction, whether it's for oil, coffee, or computer chips, has to flow through this US-controlled system. This gives the United States an extraordinary power: the ability to impose economic sanctions. When the US sanctions a country like Iran or Russia, it's not just a symbolic gesture. It means they can effectively cut that country off from the global financial system. They can freeze assets, block transactions, and make it nearly impossible for that nation to trade with the rest of the world. Because most international banks need access to the US dollar system to operate, they are forced to comply with US sanctions or risk being cut off themselves. This is a far more powerful and less costly weapon than sending in troops. It allows the US to cripple economies and pressure governments without firing a single shot. As one official famously put it, the US doesn't need to win wars, it prints them. This dominance also gives the US what has been called an exorbitant privilege. Because the world needs dollars for trade and as a safe place to store its wealth, there's a constant demand for US government debt or treasury bonds. This allows the US government to borrow money at much lower interest rates than other countries. It can run huge budget deficits to fund its military, social programs, or tax cuts, and the rest of the world effectively helps foot the bill by buying its debt. This is why you often hear about the US debt ceiling. It's the legal limit on how much the country can borrow. But because global demand for dollars is so high, the US has been able to raise that ceiling time and time again. However, this power is not without its risks. The US has been printing trillions of dollars over the last few decades, especially in response to financial crises and the recent pandemic. This massive increase in the money supply has led to concerns about inflation, not just in the US, but globally, as the value of the dollar can be diluted. Every time the US Federal Reserve adjusts interest rates, the effects ripple across the entire planet, influencing exchange rates, capital flows, and economic stability in countries from Brazil to Indonesia. This brings us to the most critical question of our time. What happens if the world stops trusting the dollar? For decades, the US dollar has been the world's safe haven. In times of crisis, everyone rushes to buy dollars. But the increasing use of sanctions as a weapon and the massive printing of money are causing some countries to rethink this reliance. Nations like China and Russia are actively trying to de-dollarize. They are conducting more trade in their own currencies, building alternative payment systems, and increasing their reserves of gold instead of dollars. The rise of digital currencies could also present a future challenge to the dollar-based system. If a viable alternative emerges, countries might start shifting their reserves away from the dollar. If that were to happen on a large scale, the consequences for the United States would be severe. The exorbitant privilege would vanish. The US would find it much harder and more expensive to finance its debt. The value of the dollar could fall, leading to higher inflation and a lower standard of living for Americans. Its ability to project power through sanctions would be dramatically reduced. The dollar's reign as the world's most powerful weapon is built on a foundation of trust. Trust that the US will manage its currency responsibly. Trust that it won't abuse its power. And trust that there is no better alternative. But as the geopolitical landscape shifts and new economic powers rise, that trust is being tested like never before. The story of the dollar is far from over, and its next chapter will shape the future of the global order. The ultimate question remains: will the world continue to put its faith in the dollar, or are we on the verge of a new financial era? What do you think? Let me know in the comments below. If you found this deep dive interesting, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more content that explores the forces shaping our world.